This is the second of two videos on Washington's domestic program, focusing, of course, on Hamilton's proposals for the economy, which dominated. Last video, we talked about the issues of funding and assumption. Well, as these debates began, another debate raged. Should the government establish a national bank? And Hamilton had an answer, and he issued his report on the national bank. Yes, he argued, the nation did indeed need to create a bank with a capitalization, or that's assets, of about 10 million, and that was way above any capitalization of state banks. Hamilton's plan called for the government to own 20% of these assets, and private investors could own the remaining 80%. In this way, he argued, the bank would not just do the government's bidding. Hamilton argued that the bank would help the U.S. The bank notes and bonds would operate as paper money, expanding the money supply and allowing the economy to grow. Also, states and private banks would take these bank notes and bonds and use them for their own capitalization, their own assets. This allowed for a way that the national government could guard against inflation. If the government was to require payment to the national bank in specie, or gold and silver coins only, or the state and private banks would probably be less likely to issue their own banknotes in excess. They would fear that if they did so, they would not be able to pay back the national bank. So it was, therefore, Hamilton suggested, an indirect way for the government to contract the economy when necessary. Finally, Hamilton argued that placing the federal government's assets in one bank made it easier to collect and dispense any government payments. Just like on the other issue, Jefferson disagreed with Hamilton's proposal, arguing that the federal government should not create a national bank, but just deposit its assets in state banks. A national bank, he argued, would serve its biggest investors, of course, when he saw them as the elite, and not the common man. Now, in a broad sense, Jefferson did not want the federal government to control the money supply, to stimulate or constrict the economy, fearing that, whatever it did in that regard, its actions would not be in the interest of the common man, but again, serve the elite. Undoubtedly influencing Jefferson's position was his belief that a national wealth lay in land and not commercial transactions. It should be noted that both Hamilton and Jefferson argued their position regarding the national bank in relation to the U.S. Constitution. It was the first time what the Constitution meant framed a national debate. Jefferson took what later people would call a strict constructionist view of the Constitution. If the Constitution allowed for a bank, it would have explicitly stated it, Jefferson said. Nowhere in the Constitution was the word bank even mentioned. Hamilton, meanwhile, said that the Constitution did allow it, and he cited the necessary and proper clause, which we mentioned earlier. The Constitution implied it was okay because a bank was needed to carry out the federal government's constitutional mandate. Now, Hamilton's view would later be termed a broad constructionist view of the Constitution. In a sense, Jefferson was saying if it doesn't say that the government can do something, it can't. And Hamilton was saying if it doesn't say the government can't do it, it can. But anyway, these two conflicting interpretations have characterized many actions over the role of the federal government in the last 250 years. I should note that in this instance, there was not yet judicial review. The Supreme Court had not yet established its powers to act as a decider of what the Constitution meant. In the end, Hamilton's plan passed Congress, and Washington, siding with Hamilton once again, signed it. So again, you can see Washington is sort of getting a reputation as leaning towards the Federalist. The first bank of the United States, shown here, got a 20-year charter and was set to expire in 1811. Much to Hamilton's relief, the sale of bank stock to private investors went pretty well. Hamilton's third major economic report, his proposals, was a report on manufacturers. A draft is shown of this in the right here. The federal government should regulate trade for the common good by passing a tariff, Hamilton's report argued. This would help promote manufacturing. The government should also pass an excise tax. An excise tax is a government tax on a specific good or service. Both a tariff and an excise tax, Hamilton argued, would give the federal government the additional revenue it desperately needed. Jefferson predictably disagreed. He had no interest in encouraging manufacturing, of course. And, many southern states who still exported a lot of their staple crops, they feared that any country facing an American tariff on its exports would retaliate, placing a tariff on any American goods entering their country. This didn't sway Washington, and once again, Washington sided with Hamilton. The Tariff of 1789 placed a 6-cent per ton tax on imported items brought to the United States on American ships, and a 50-cent per ton tax on imported items brought on foreign ships. Congress later passed the United States' first excise tax, a tax on distillers of alcohol. Hamilton and Congress expected the distillers to pass along the additional costs they faced by raising their prices. Here on the right, you can see it's a compilation they published of the acts of the very first U.S. Congress, which included the tax and the tariff. Washington's decisions favoring Hamilton's economic agenda predictably strained Washington's relations with Jefferson, and explains again that why Washington's considered one of the Federalist Party. And Washington feared the emerging political factions and tried to be above all the growing animosity between Hamilton's followers and Jefferson's followers, but he had to make a decision on these issues. An early Federalist Party ribbon is shown here, and you can see it's got George Washington on it. In general, Hamilton's economic agenda was successful. The economy began to expand rapidly, and several private stock markets began to grow. The first was in Philadelphia in 1792, but in New York City, a group of investors got together in what later became known as the Buttonwood Agreement. And you can see that here. It's named for where they met under a buttonwood tree outside number 68 Wall Street. And, they met there and they agreed to a standard commission on stock sales and basic protocols for the sale of private company stock to the public. The Buttonwood Agreement grew into the New York Stock Exchange, of course, one of the largest exchanges in the world today. Because it was located on Wall Street, that's where the term Wall Street comes from. It represents stocks and big banks and so forth. Shown in this picture is the New York Stock Exchange today at the end of Wall Street. You can see it there with the columns. And it's seen from the perspective of the old Federalist Hall, where Washington had taken the his first oath of office. And today that building has a statue of George Washington you can see on the right. While Hamilton's economic agenda foretold the modern American economy, there was an early issue with the national bank that caused concern. Rumors began to spread that the first bank of the United States was going to buy the Bank of New York. And this produced a speculative bubble in the price of bank stocks. Everybody was buying them. The price of bank stocks rose. When this purchase did not take place, however, the bubble popped and prices plummeted. It was Wall Street's first panic, and there'd be lots of others over the years, bank panics. And like any bank panic, a lot of people lost money. Jefferson was happy to cast blame on the first bank of the United States, which he disliked, but the panic actually strengthened that first bank. Hamilton encouraged the bank to buy up all the low-priced bank stock after the bubble popped, not only stabilizing the market and prices, but also allowing the national bank to get a lot of good stocks cheaply. In saying the economy was a success and that Hamilton's plan was successful, I should note that there was another problem than just a short-lived bank panic. There were a couple of rough spots in the 1790s. One was the Whiskey Rebellion, as it was called, in 1794. Hamilton's tax on distillers upset many people in the western frontier, especially in the western frontier of Pennsylvania. While most distillers successfully passed the cost onto their consumers in the form of higher prices, as Hamilton suggested, in this part of the western frontier, a lack of roads had made the economy, even just incredibly based on distilled spirits. It was alcohol was almost bartered for goods and services. It was so important out there. As a result, the tax hit even harder than elsewhere, and the people got exceptionally ticked off. The protest produced a band of rebels, and when they refused to disperse, an angry Washington led federal troops to put down the rebellion. It was the only time in American history where a sitting president led troops to battle. As it turned out, however, the approach of both a big federal army with the famed George Washington at its head caused the rebels to melt away. The rebellion fizzled, and Washington ended up pardoning them all. In a sense, that the Whiskey Rebellion was important because it demonstrated that the federal government was willing to back up with force the new Hamilton economic scheme it had just created. With people aware of this, it gave people more assurance that the system would last, and thus led to more investment and consumer confidence. I want to conclude this second video on George Washington's domestic policies, focusing on the economy, Hamilton's plan, by noting that it was during George Washington's first presidency that we had the first U.S. census. It was held in 1790 as mandated by the Constitution. And of course, this census is very important in determining representation. And so we have, if you are a researcher, you have the census reports, very critical for historians, all the way back to 1790. Anyway, this concludes the second video on George Washington's domestic policies, which of course focused so much on Hamilton's economic agenda.